Worth noting here that the phrase by faith in this context, in this small section, is written 5 times. So we'll break that down a bit. And in Greek, the word here is also pistis. Everyone say pistis. Good. It means not just faith, but also a deeper understanding of belief, of trust, of value, and of loyalty. So let's turn to our Bibles here. We're starting in verse 23. By faith, Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth, because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for the Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, unafraid of the king's anger, for he persevered as though he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as if it were dry land, but when the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned. So there's a lot in that. So allow me to recap the story of Moses. There's a lot to the story, and I'm going to do a very brief overview. So I want to encourage you, as I usually do, to go back to Exodus and read for yourself sometime this week. It starts in Exodus 1, this whole story. But here's the overview. So at that time, there was an edict from Pharaoh that all firstborn boys of the Hebrews were to be killed at birth. Now, to understand how this happened, we have to kind of back up a bit. 7 generations before this, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, and then he rose to prominence in Egypt. In response to God's prompting, Joseph created this very effective system to store grain during years of plenty so that in years of famine, Egypt didn't suffer. And Pharaoh appreciated his wisdom so much that he promoted him, even though he was a Hebrew, to become second in command of all of Egypt. Now, people from all over Egypt came to buy food during famine, including Joseph's family. And after a great reunion, obviously, as you're hearing, we are like overview, like way up here, okay? There's so much stuff that happens, so much drama. But after a great reunion, he ends up moving his father Jacob and his brothers to Egypt so they could be closer to him to live in the land of plenty. Now, the first chapter of Exodus tells us that there were 70 people born from Jacob. Now, that's a very large family. He was very busy. But as we read on, we see that the Israelites were fruitful and prolific even after that, when they got to Egypt. It says that they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, outnumbering the Egyptians. Now, let's fast forward 7 generations. There's a new Pharaoh, because he would be really old by now. It was the same one. Here's a Pharaoh that was nervous about how outnumbered they are by foreigners. He didn't know the history. 7 generations is a long time. We don't remember ourselves 7 generations from today, right? And he decides the best way to respond is to enslave all the Hebrew people using oppression and forced labor as a way to keep them under his thumb. Now, Pharaoh doesn't stop there. He orders the death of every firstborn boy of the Hebrews. And this is where the story of Moses begins. His parents give birth to Moses, and when he was born a boy, they decided not to kill him, but instead keep him hidden. After 3 months, they send him down the river Nile in a waterproof basket, where Pharaoh finds him, she adopts him as his own son, and Moses is then raised in the palace of the Egyptians with all the power and privilege as a royal. And as an adult, he realizes his people are the Hebrews, and he starts to see the injustices. So he fights it. He fights the oppression of Egypt against the enslaved Hebrews, which lands him in exile. And after some time, God calls him to do the impossible, to free the people from an evil empire of Egypt. After a lot of plagues and death in Egypt, 10 plagues to be exact, Pharaoh agrees to let the Hebrew people leave, but only just to change his mind just a few days later, which causes the biggest chase scene in the Old Testament. The Egyptian army chases the Hebrew people all throughout the land, and miracles upon miracles happen. God splits the Red Sea for his people to escape, and as they walk through unharmed, and as the last Hebrew steps onto dry land, on the other side, God releases this tunnel of water and it collapses in onto the Egyptian army, drowning every single last one. Now, clearly, there are a lot more details. I did a very fast overview. And again, I want to invite you to read the story on your own. But today, this is kind of the backdrop of the story that we're zooming in on in Hebrews 11. So let's break it apart a bit. So the first faith statement, by faith statement here is in 23. And it says, by faith Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth, because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Okay, so we see this very first act of Moses' story isn't actually what he does. It's what his parents do. It's what's done to him. He is hidden away for 3 months. Now, anybody that's ever been around a newborn, I don't know how you hide that thing. Babies aren't quiet. You hear them right now? Perfect timing. Thanks for playing along. You're welcome in here. Stay. It's really good for the story part of it. Babies aren't quiet. They don't understand what you're trying to tell them. They shouldn't. And they don't obey. It's easy to see how this bold act of faith on his parents' part was kind of a big deal, because they ignored Pharaoh's edict despite the possible consequences, because they saw that the child was beautiful. I think it's fair to say that all parents think their kids are beautiful. God worked that chemistry into our brain, oxytocin, dopamine, and vasopressin, that's released into our brain to facilitate these these intense feelings of love and connection to our babies, purely, I think, for their survival. Because who else that wakes you up multiple times a night and makes you clean up their poopies who would want them around, right? If a full-grown adult comes to your house and acts the way the baby does, I don't think they would be allowed to stay much longer than an hour, much less 3 months, okay? So chemistry in the brain to love babies, that's a good thing. Not learning manners as an adult, be better. So Moses' parents see him as beautiful, but the Greek word here is not just beautiful, it's astios. Everyone say astios. Astios. It doesn't just mean beautiful. There's a deeper perception of this unusual, superior nature. This is the same term used to describe Isaac as Abraham's only begotten son. Moses wasn't some ordinary child receiving affection from his parents, but there was a realization that God had special purposes for Moses. And this passage begins with, by faith, because Moses' parents saw something greater, and they kept their eyes on 2 things: God's power in the present and God's promises for the future. They took great risk in doing what they believed to be right in God's eyes. And they weren't afraid of Pharaoh, who was a mere human, because they trusted in the God who created Pharaoh. Then when we keep our eyes focused on God's promises and his power, fear is defeated. And that's the theme of the first section here. Fear is defeated. I'm not saying fear isn't important or that we should ignore it. In fact, fear is something that prompts us to respond appropriately in situations. Ignoring it would keep us in danger. But what is important in this context is that the fear of God should supersede the fear of earthly things, because by faith, fear is conquered. Let's break down this next section here, starting in 24. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for the Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to the reward. So we see the faith of his parents has now shifted to Moses. And as a grown man, Moses declines his position as a prince. He gives up his title, his privilege, and his comfort, and he chooses to be lowered into mistreatment alongside his Hebrew brothers and sisters. Moses embraces this abuse and rejects all of Egypt's pleasures. Now, pleasure, when provided by God, is a good thing. But false pleasure pleasure created by humans is associated with sin, which is why Matthew 6 tells us not to store up treasures on earth, but instead in heaven. And Moses willingly left every comfort he knew to move towards God's promises, abandoning three things. The first thing is social honors. He had the choice between the invincible glories of Egyptian court and the vulnerabilities of the desert, the two, and he chose the latter. It's only by faith that anyone would willingly choose social deprivation like this. The second thing he chose was physical satisfaction, or he did not choose. He gave up. The Egyptian palace provided pleasures beyond his wildest dreams, but Moses identified them all as sinful and fleeting at best. And the third thing he abandoned was material gain. Now, the riches and treasures of Egypt were proverbial legendary, but Moses, by faith, chose the opposite. He made intentional decisions. The second section is about intentional decisions. He made intentional decisions to please God and help others. Now, like Moses, we're confronted with worldly alternatives every day, all the time. And I wonder, are we making decisions by faith, or are we making decisions by our own limited understanding? I don't know about you, sometimes I like to say that it's God when it's my own discernment, because I would rather have it this way. But let's move to the third by faith example in verse 27 here. By faith, he left Egypt, unafraid of the king's anger, for he persevered as though he saw him who is invisible. I'd like to note here, if you're reading this, it's growing in magnitude and intensity in acts of faith. So the first thing we see is Moses, who is hidden by his parents. This is a secret act. And it shifts when Moses rejects his privilege in society. But then he doesn't just leave Egypt here. The word here is katalipo. Everyone say katalipo. Great. And katalipo means completely abandon. There's a difference between just leaving and completely I'm out of here, deuces, right? He abandoned Egypt completely and he was unafraid doing it. Now, this is not to say that Moses didn't feel fear. Earlier in the story, if you read in Exodus, Moses murders an Egyptian when he witnesses unjust treatment toward a fellow Hebrew. We read in Exodus that Moses fled to Midian because he was afraid. But this time, Moses left unafraid. Even after Pharaoh had hit rock bottom with successive plagues that he ignored, obviously Pharaoh was angry. No leader of that magnitude wants to look like a loser, okay? And an angry king rarely lets the opposing party out without bloodshed. But Moses didn't obsess over Pharaoh's anger. Instead, he meditated on God's mercy. Moses was unmoved by king's anger because he knew the will of God was greater than any human being. And what the text says here is he saw him. The Greek word is horao. Everyone say horao. Let's try it again, horao. Another translation says that his eyes were fixed. Just as an artist, when they keep their eyes fixed on an object or a model that they are painting or sculpting, the word horao indicates an unwavering choice to look away from one thing so they can focus on another. So the third example of faith reminds us to fix our eyes. We fix our eyes on the ultimate, not the immediate. We fix our eyes on the eternal award, not the temporary gain. We fix our eyes on a God that we cannot see. And fixing our eyes on God takes purpose and intention. The first three examples of faith in this text in Moses' life builds an undeniable case for the endurance of the worst inflictions from an unbelieving world. And all this is done in faith, and God is responding in real and active ways. But by this next by faith statement, this next by faith illustration, we transition from the examples of hardship to instances of deliverance. We see a shift in the whole matter. So here in verse 28 it says this, by faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood so the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. So this is the last and the most devastating plague that was in Egypt, that hit Egypt. The destroyer of the firstborn, also known as the angel of death. And because the 9 earlier attempts didn't convince Pharaoh because it fell on deaf ears, God told Moses to instruct every Hebrew household to sprinkle the blood of an unblemished sacrificial lamb to the outdoor or outside doorposts of their homes. Now, this had never been done before, so it wasn't like, oh, this makes sense. In fact, you can imagine, it's weird, right? The angel of death passed through every home that night, killing every firstborn. And can you imagine the overwhelming devastation of a whole nation? Every household was affected. And sometimes we picture it as like just the kid, but no, I'm a firstborn. Every firstborn, young and old. The only families spared were the ones that brought their unqualified but unified obedience to the Lord. And the angel of death literally passed over their homes, sanctified by the blood of the Lamb, leaving their firstborns unharmed. Even after doing so, doing as the Lord commanded, I bet that night was terrifying. And here we see that obedience requires action. This was costly to everyone involved, not just those who lost their children, but the Hebrew people realized the cost of obeying God this way. Remember, they were enslaved and impoverished. They could barely afford food, probably not a lot of meat in their diet, much less a whole unblemished lamb. The less blemishing, the more expensive. So they had to take action. They had to work together as a community and be real with each other about what they had and what they didn't have. They had to give up their pride so that their families could survive. And they came together to do what needed to be done. Because obedience requires action, because faith is living and active. But Moses didn't just do the Passover just one time. This text here says he established it for all time as a memorial to the faithfulness of God. And that's why Jewish people to this day continue to observe Passover. It's still an act and a memorial of what it means to live by faith. And action is what leads to transformation. If we feel stuck, unchanging, frustrated, maybe we feel unmoved, is it because we aren't taking action? Or maybe we're taking the wrong action. For some of us, taking actions means we actually need to be still. Stillness is a very intentional action that is unpracticed in the Western world. So we need to ask ourselves, is our obedience lacking action? And the last act of faith in this passage is verse 29. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as if it were dry land, but when the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned. And this is where we experience a very real God, even though he is unseen. Not only did God deliver them through the Passover, but he leads them through the Red Sea onto dry ground. He leads them by cloud by day and by fire by night. And by faith, they passed through the Red Sea as the Egyptian army chased them. And it was by faith that these migrants, these refugees, these exiles stepped onto the Red Sea, and God preserved their lives. Moses had been taught from his very first breath that God preserves lives. He is the life preserver. So he knew he could trust God to preserve the lives of the people he was called to lead. Can you imagine, though, walls of water on each side of you? Feet, like 30 feet high, 40 feet high. And just as you're walking through it, I doubt any of us would be okay. It's by faith that they did that. But I won't lie. If I were traveling through, I'd be like, I believe you, but also like, what's happening? They were for sure distressed, but this letter that we're reading here in the first century, they're reminded to believe in the God of the impossible. Through God, the impossible becomes possible. Can I be honest? Living by faith is very difficult for me. I sometimes don't even know what faith is. Or I question whether I have it. So if you feel that way, sometimes, you're in good company. But from this passage, we're together learning that by faith, fear is defeated. And faith involves intentional decisions. And faith forces us to fix our eyes on our Creator. And the proof of faith is seen in obedience that requires action. And faith is believing the impossible to become possible. We read in this short passage that it's easy to feel like Moses did. Like he did it all perfectly. I'm going to invite the band to come up now. And we have completely maybe missed the mark ourselves. But when you read the story of Moses at home this week, because all my sermons come with homework, you're welcome. You will see how Moses was perfectly human. Here's a man who was set apart from birth because there was something special about him. And this is the same man who failed time and time again. And he didn't always have faith in God, but he did choose obedience. He obeyed and he worshiped the creator of the universe. And he may not have believed in his own abilities, but he never questioned God's ability. And he may have doubted himself, but he never doubted God. And I wonder if that's what faith is. Faith isn't the end, but rather, faith is the means. It's not that we'll make it through. It's more that God has already paved the way. It's not that we'll be saved from suffering, but in our suffering that we're pulled closer to a Savior who also suffered. It's not that the universe was made, but that the universe was made through the Word of God. Faith is not what is seen. Rather, faith is centered in the unseen. By faith, we can overcome obstacles and difficulties. By faith, we find opportunities to prove God's power and faithfulness in an unbelieving world. And by faith, we get to see the impossible become possible as we grow in faith. We do our best to believe and trust in a God who created all of this. But more importantly, we're created simply to worship Him. If you today are like me and you feel like you just don't have enough faith, or maybe you've given faith a chance and it's failed you time and time again, I want to invite you just to worship. Because whether we have faith or not, God is still good. We're going to worship in a bit here, and I want to invite you to use the altars up here. We have a prayer team that will pray over you. We're meant to do this together in community, just as the Hebrew people did, not on our own. Will you pray with me? God of creation, we thank you for going before us in everything we experience, and even the things we have yet to experience. Forgive us for the times that we put faith in ourselves instead of in you. God, we repent for putting the infinite God who spoke light into darkness into a tiny, small-minded box. Forgive us for what we don't understand. We ask for more of you, but for now, we just want to worship you for who you have been, who you are, and who you are to be. So God, hear our worship, hear our souls crying out, and if you would, please grant us a few more drops of faith.